What if you were the only one who stopped to help, while the rest of the world just laughed and filmed your struggle like a circus act? What if your act of humanity was twisted into a joke, your compassion into a public humiliation? Would you still choose to do what's right, knowing the world would crucify you for it? This is not just a story about cruelty or kindness. It's a brutal reminder that sometimes the line between hero and victim is drawn in blood, not applause. Stay until the end, because the moment the black SUVs arrive, the entire world you thought you knew will shatter. Under the relentless blaze of a late July sun, the asphalt of Highway 47 shimmered like liquid glass, the air itself heavy and slow. Cicadas screaming from the brittle grass that lined the endless suburban sprawl when the sharp screech of twisting metal shattered the afternoon heat. A silver sedan spinning out of control, slamming into a rusted guardrail with a final sickening crunch that echoed down the empty stretch of road. Within minutes, a crowd gathered their SUVs and pickup trucks, lining the shoulder doors, slamming sunglasses, flashing phones already in hand, recording, gawking, murmuring behind manicured hands as they kept their distance. The man slumped against the steering wheel, bleeding from a gash at his temple, his chest heaving shallow and erratic. Nobody moved to help. A teenage boy in a backward cap laughed nervously, nudging his friend. Bet he was texting, while a woman in yoga pants shook her head and muttered, "Darwin Award for sure." The smell of scorched rubber and gasoline hung thick in the air, but the only thing sharper was the stench of indifference. Then, from across the street, a figure appeared, running with urgency that cut through the stagnant heat like a blade. Naomi Ellis, her simple sundress fluttering against her legs, her sneakers slapping the pavement braids tied back from her striking, determined face. She ignored the sneers, the smirks, the raised phones capturing her every step. What's she gonna do? Someone chuckled. Sing him back to life. Another voice sneered. Naomi didn't slow. She didn't flinch. She dropped to her knees beside the wrecked car, her hands already moving, checking his pulse, speaking to him with a soft steadiness that rose above the low tide of cruel laughter. Blood stained her hands, but she didn't hesitate, pulling off her sweater, pressing it against his wound, whispering encouragement, while the bystanders watched, entertained, but unmoved. Naomi's skin glowed under the cruel sun, a stark, beautiful defiance against the ugliness around her, her every action screaming a truth. None of them wanted to see that compassion wears no color, and sometimes salvation looks like the girl you laughed at 5 minutes ago. The laughter rose sharp and biting, curling around Naomi like smoke as she pressed her jacket tighter against the man's bleeding head, the bright red blooming across the pale blue fabric like a terrible flower. Yet the crowd didn't offer a hand, didn't offer help, only more cruel amusement. Phones were thrust closer, their lenses hungry for scandal, for mockery, their owners jeering. Look at her playing hero. One man snorted his beer belly, jiggling with each wheezing laugh. A woman in a sun visor added, probably hoping to sue someone, watch out, next thing you know she's crying on the news. Another voice, sharp and venomous, called out, she wants to be famous, that's all classic pity parade. Naomi heard every word, each one slicing against her composure, but her hands didn't falter. Her breathing stayed even, and her focus remained locked on the battered man before her. His eyes, barely open, fluttered beneath the heavy curtain of blood trickling down his temple, and through his haze he saw only her, a blurred halo of brown skin and fierce kindness, heard only her voice, low and steady, cutting through the ringing in his ears. Stay with me. Naomi whispered, brushing the hair from his forehead. Help is coming. You're going to be all right, I promise. Her hands moved with a precision born not of training, but of pure stubborn will. Dialing 911 with blood-slicked fingers, barking out coordinates to the dispatcher, even as someone nearby mimicked her shrieking into an invisible phone, sending waves of derisive laughter through the growing crowd. Naomi ignored them all, shielding the wounded man from the blistering sun, with her own body speaking to him in soothing rhythmic tones, anchoring him to this side of consciousness, to hope even as those around her drowned in their own cruelty. The ambulance's sirens wailed against the bruised evening sky, and Naomi sat hunched in the corner of the vehicle, her hands sticky with drying blood, her heart hammering, not from fear, but from the stubborn, desperate hope that the man beside her would live. She whispered quiet prayers under her breath, not knowing his name, not asking for anything in return, just willing him to stay tethered to life. At the hospital, she helped the paramedics wheel him through the automatic doors, but when the nurse asked for her name for the report, Naomi simply shook her head, stepping back into the fluorescent light with a tired, solemn smile, then turned and walked away without a word, fading into the growing night like a ghost who had done her part. At home, her small apartment felt colder, tighter, and soon the notifications on her cracked phone screen began to flood in ugly comments surfacing like oil in water, strangers and neighbors alike, sharing the video, labeling her a fraud, a clout chaser, a liar, desperate for attention. Naomi sat on the edge of her worn-out couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she scrolled through the venom. Each cruel word, another stone laid against her chest, suffocating and heavy. Yet still, she sat upright, her back straight, her chin high, because despite the chorus of mockery echoing through her cracked walls, her battered timeline, and her aching heart, she knew the truth. She had seen life bleeding out onto asphalt. She had heard a man's broken breathing, had felt the frailty of existence between her fingers, and she had chosen compassion, not because she would be praised, not because anyone was watching, but because it was right. And that quiet certainty burned inside her, a tiny stubborn flame that no laughter, no cruelty, no hatred could ever extinguish. The sun barely crested the low rooftops, casting thin gold across the battered sidewalks of Naomi's neighborhood, when the low rumbling purr of engines shattered the morning stillness. 5 black SUVs, their chrome gleaming like blades under the new day's light, rolled to a stop in front of Naomi's modest apartment building, their synchronized halt crisp and deliberate, like a silent drumbeat that called every eye to the street. Windows creaked open, curtains twitched, neighbors emerged in loose pajamas and hurried slippers, clutching mugs and phones, their voices a low tide of speculation. "I told you." One woman hissed, nudging her husband with a bony elbow. "That girl stirred up some serious trouble," while another man muttered into his coffee, "What's she done now, huh, bringing the feds down on us?" From the lead SUV, the doors swung open in perfect choreography, and out stepped men in tailored black suits, their sunglasses polished to a mirror sheen, each movement crisp, professional, sending a shiver through the curious onlookers, who instinctively stepped back from the sheer authority that radiated from the group. For a breathless moment, the world seemed to pause, the summer heat pressing heavier against the cracked concrete, and then another figure emerged, moving slower, deliberate, leaning heavily on a polished cane, his presence a tidal force all its own. Alexander Kane, the recluse billionaire whose holdings spanned everything from tech giants to humanitarian foundations, whose face had only ever been glimpsed in blurred paparazzi shots and Forbes profiles, now stood in the middle of Naomi's crumbling street, his gray hair gleaming like steel under the morning sun, his tailored suit sitting lightly on his tall, imposing frame. Gasps broke out in the crowd. Someone dropped a coffee mug. Another fumbled to unlock their phone, frantic to catch this impossible sight. But Kane ignored them all, his gaze fixed solely on the small weather-worn building ahead, his expression unreadable. Naomi, still in her faded t-shirt and jeans, barefoot on the cool floor, peered out her window, her breath catching in her throat, confusion and alarm tightening around her ribs as she watched the impossible unfold just yards from her door. A soft knock rattled her battered front door, polite, yet somehow insistent, and when she opened it, it was not one of the suited men who stood there, but Kane himself, his pale blue eyes, steady kind, and infinitely tired. "Miss Ellis," he said, his voice deep and rough like gravel. "You saved my life yesterday when no one else would." He paused, his gaze sweeping briefly over the gathered crowd, over the whispering neighbors and clicking cameras, before settling back on her unwavering, "You didn't ask for anything. You didn't even leave your name. But today, the world will know who you are not, because you sought fame, but because you chose humanity when no one else did." Behind him, an aide stepped forward carrying a slim black case, and as Kane opened it, the sun caught the glint of a deed, a certificate, documents that shimmered with authority, with wealth, with promise. "This," Kane continued, his voice resonant over the stunned gasps of the crowd, "is yours now, Naomi. A home, a scholarship fund in your name, and an invitation to join the board of my newest foundation, dedicated to rebuilding the broken parts of this world, because courage like yours is rarer than any fortune." And the world tilted. The breath rushed from Naomi's lungs, her knees threatening to give way under the tidal wave of shock and disbelief. But Kane simply smiled, warm and fierce, and added, "You didn't just save a man yesterday, Naomi. You saved the last of his faith in humanity." A tear, unbidden, carved a hot trail down her cheek as the crowd around her fell into stunned silence, their earlier mockery evaporating under the weight of their shame. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi Ellis stood not as an outcast, not as a subject of ridicule, but as a beacon, a reminder that real strength often looks like kindness, and real heroes rarely wear capes. The days that followed were nothing Naomi could have ever imagined. Her quiet life exploded into a hurricane of attention she neither asked for, nor knew how to navigate. News vans clogged the narrow streets outside her apartment, reporters shouting her name, their cameras flashing like strobe lights every time she dared crack open her door. Overnight, her face became the symbol of something raw and desperately needed: compassion without expectation, bravery without armor. Viral videos flooded every platform, not the cruel footage of her being mocked, but the moment Kane stood beside her, calling her a hero, calling her hope itself. Hashtags like Naomi, the brave, and kindness wins trended worldwide. Celebrities tweeted about her late-night hosts, praised her schools, taught her story in morning assemblies. Yet Naomi felt none of it truly touch her. Her world inside, still trembling, still small, still trying to make sense of the seismic shift. Job offers poured in, companies desperate to associate with her name, foundations begging her to be their ambassador, TV producers dangling reality shows and book deals. But Naomi turned them all down, her heart refusing to cheapen what had happened into something marketable, something hollow. Her mailbox overflowed with letters, some filled with gratitude, others with hate, old prejudices dying slower than she had hoped. Neighbors who once sneered at her now left pies and awkward apology notes on her stoop, too ashamed to meet her eyes. But Naomi didn't need their pity. She never had. Meanwhile, Cain stayed true to his word. The deed to a beautiful townhouse on the lake was signed into her name. Within the week, a full-ride scholarship to any university she chose lay waiting on her kitchen counter, along with an open invitation to join Cain's newly founded Humanity First initiative as a board member. Yet the shift was more than material. Naomi's name now carried weight, it carried hope, and for some, it carried the burning sting of shame. The local police department launched an internal investigation into the officers who had stood idly by, laughing, while a man bled on the asphalt. Those who filmed instead of acted, those who chose cruelty, when compassion called resignations, followed suspensions handed out like bitter candy. Reforms rushed into place by red-faced officials desperate to scrub the stain from their record. Naomi, once invisible, now walked through her neighborhood like a flame through dry grass. Some bowed their heads in respect. Others turned away in embarrassment, but none could pretend they hadn't seen, hadn't judged, hadn't failed. For Naomi, the real shift came quieter, deeper nights when she lay in her new home staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of being both a symbol and still just herself, a woman who had seen the worst in people, but still believed in the best, a woman who had loved when it cost her everything and was now learning to be loved without suspicion. It wasn't fame that filled her chest with warmth when she thought of Cain. It wasn't the wealth now tied to her name. It was the simple fact that somewhere in the noise and chaos, two lives had been pulled back from the edge, not by grand gestures or heroic battles, but by a single stubborn act of kindness on a forgotten road under an unforgiving sun. Months later, the echoes of that day had transformed into something tangible, something Naomi could touch, feel, breathe. Cain's Humanity. First Initiative launched its first project in Naomi's name, a sprawling network of mobile emergency clinics designed to reach rural and underserved communities. Bright white vans, with her name in small, humble letters. By the door, not shouting for credit, just quietly changing lives. Naomi stood at the ribbon, cutting her hands, trembling slightly. The crowd cheering, but her eyes stayed steady, focused not on the cameras, but on the kids peeking around their mother's legs. The elderly veterans gripping canes with trembling fingers. People who knew what it meant to be overlooked, to be left bleeding on the side of the road, to wonder if help would ever come. Naomi didn't want to be a celebrity. She didn't want to be a brand. She wanted to be a bridge, and she built it every day with small steps, answering letters from teenagers who wrote about feeling invisible, hugging single mothers who whispered their thanks, with tears staining their cheeks, sitting quietly with survivors who carried more scars than visible wounds. Cain, true to his quiet nature, never made grand speeches, but he showed up every event, every meeting, always a few steps behind Naomi, letting her lead, letting her light guide the way. The bond between them unspoken but unbreakable, built not on obligation, but on something rarer, purer, an understanding that kindness was not weakness, that compassion was not naivety, that real change began, not with noise, but with relentless, stubborn love. The media eventually moved on, hungry for new stories, new outrage, but Naomi remained a steady flame in a world too quick to forget, and slowly, quietly, her neighborhood changed, not because of fear, not because of shame, but because of choice, because one woman had refused to look away, refused to be silent, refused to harden her heart in the face of cruelty. Kids who once laughed at the difference now waved at Naomi's van as it rolled by. Old men who once muttered slurs under their breath now tipped their hats respectfully. Women who once crossed the street to avoid her now brought casseroles and offered rides and asked for forgiveness without words. Naomi knew not every heart would change, not every wound would heal, but she also knew she didn't need to fix the whole world to matter. She just needed to keep showing up, to keep choosing love when hate would be easier, to keep believing that no act of kindness was ever wasted. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the world turned molten gold, Naomi stood by the same stretch of road where it had all begun, the asphalt still scarred, but healing just like her. She placed a small plaque by the ditch, not big, not flashy, just a simple reminder carved into brushed steel. Kindness builds roads, where walls once stood. Naomi smiled a quiet, fierce smile, the kind that grows roots deep in the soul. Then she turned away, walking toward the future she had built, with blood, with hope, with an unbreakable heart. Her shadow, long her steps, steady her legacy, just beginning. Some wounds don't bleed, they echo. Some injustices don't scream, they whisper through every cracked smile, every averted gaze. Naomi didn't just save a life that day. She exposed a sickness buried beneath polite society, a sickness that laughed at pain and mocked mercy. But she also showed something far more dangerous to the world's cruelty. She showed resilience. She showed that no matter how deep the hatred, one stubborn act of love could fracture the walls built by centuries of indifference. Remember this: kindness costs nothing but exposes everything. Next time you see someone bleeding by the side of the road, ask yourself, will you help or will you film? Because history is watching.